Welcome everybody. Welcome to this conversation on a very important topic for the University of Padua. The university has a liberal institution, in our case, after 8 centuries of history. In fact, this meeting is part of the official program of celebrations for the 800th anniversary of the University of Padua. We have today a very important scholar connected who is a privilege to welcome as our guest, even if only online, unfortunately. But it will be just a preview for a future forthcoming invitation in presence in Padua. Today, we anticipate the series of lectures on freedom that our university is going to propose in March, so in the forthcoming weeks, at the Verdi Theatre in collaboration with Stabile. So I'm going to introduce with great pleasure today Professor Deirdre McCloskey, who is Distinguished Professor in Economic History, but also English and Communication at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Professor McCloskey is one of the most influential economists and historians on the international scene. She has received many honorary doctorates and also a great career. In few words, I could say that her work is crucial for our understanding of the origin of modernity, the world we live in today, of capitalism, the scientific basis of economic models, even the rhetoric of economics. And she's one of the main actors, I could say, in the movement, in the international movement for a quantitative approach to economic history. Among her many books, we remember those on rhetoric in economics, economic history of Britain, and the very famous trilogy on the bourgeois era, so the ethics of the age of commerce. So that is on the bourgeois virtues, dignity, and equality. So thanks so much, Deirdre, for being here. We are eager to hear your thoughts on university as a liberal institution, and thank you again for accepting our invitation. So now the virtual floor is for you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm only sorry that I that I have to address you in Inglese. I have tiny little scraps of Italian, sempre caro mi fu quest'ermo cole, etc., etc. But if I tried in Italian, I would not only be ungrammatical, I would stutter, even worse than I do. So we'll try this in English. In 1819, the Swiss philosopher Constant, in the wake of the French Revolution, made a distinction between ancient liberty and modern liberty. Ancient liberty, in his view, was the right of a nation, such as the student nations at the University of Padova in medieval times, or indeed the corporate body of the university itself to, as we say, determine itself. Collective self-determination is the phrase. Modern nationalism, for example, such as in the Risorgimento, is about this so-called ancient liberty. Italy, that geographical expression, was to have the right to determine itself free of Austrian or other external governance. Now observe that the self in the expression was here's self-determination of Eastern Ukraine or Afghanistan, or indeed an ordinary commercial corporation, is metaphorical. The senators or the bureaucrats of the Italian state are not as a group self-determining, because a group isn't a group is not a self, not actually. You can tell much better than I can if the achievement in 1871 of self-determination of the Italians has turned out well. This self-determination of universities, their ancient liberty, is indeed the distinctive right of the old universities of Europe. The secular or religious authorities were not allowed to enter the university without permission. This very university is, as you know, the second oldest in Italy. It was born out of dissent at the University of Bologna, students and faculty moving to Padova to achieve more academic liberty, free from civic or church interference. Now, observe further that in ancient liberty, the individual person had no self-determination. When Athens was under attack from Sparta, you took down your spear and shield and went off to fight for Athens's independence from Sparta. Modern liberty, in Constance terminology, by contrast, is the individual right to be left alone by corporate entities such as states or even universities. It's in Kant's term autonomy, Greek for self-determination of a single person. The only constraint on such modern liberty, characteristic of an entirely new 18th century liberalism, is not to interfere with the rights of others to that same right. You're not at liberty to punch me in the face. I hope that's true in Italian law. Your liberty stops at my nose. So the protesters, in the name of liberty against COVID-19 restrictions in my own country and now in Canada, are merely selfish fools if they're saying that their liberty is to blow COVID-19 virus up my nose. Modern liberty, observe, is not is not a figure of speech. It's not metaphorical. It is, as the Latin says, the right to be individually a non-slave and a non-child. In many matters that a slave or a child would have no self-determination, such as what to eat for lunch or what job to do, I wish I didn't stutter on the word liberal. I apologize. In a liberal republic, no King Vittorio Emanuele, no senators, no state bureaucrat is imagined to stand over the Italians having this non-slavery freedom. Now the word in Romance languages is of course from Latin, a free man. If you examine a Latin dictionary, you will find that it's devoted exclusively to this legal status of a free adult. Only much later was the word extended to say freedom from sin, extended metaphorically. Now, in recent times, the English and Germanic word freedom, which sounds like the same idea as liberty, has come to connote a distinctively recent form of ancient liberty, what the English philosopher Isaiah Berlin called in 1958 positive liberty. That is, the right to have things such as publicly financed income or healthcare or education. In his terminology, negative liberty is a version of conscience modern and is the right not to have a master, a husband, a public official, a policeman bossing you around. The economist Amartya Sen, therefore, in line with this English word, English and German and Dutch and so forth word, freedom, speaks of, I think most unwisely, of economic development as freedom. The Latin word in English, you see, has kept its political meaning. That is freedom from interference. It's not, as positive liberty is, the right to have possessions, for example, what Sen called capabilities. Negative liberty merely says, leave me alone, thank you very much. It's the core of the entirely new idea in the 18th century that mastership should be abolished, that hierarchies should be flattened, that all of us should have, as the slave owner Thomas Jefferson put it, the state that all men and women, dear, are created equal. Now, why then do I point accusingly to the admirable Amartya Sen for using the English word freedom in this modern way. The confusion matters because freedom, understood as capabilities or the right to food, slips in, so to speak, socialism that's hostile to negative liberty. I also stutter on the word negative, which is equally irritating. We classical liberals, on the contrary, unlike Amartya, have a great deal of evidence for the proposition that negative liberty, allowing Italians to try out new designs, new jobs, new ideas, causes, this is quite important, causes high income, good health care, universal education. But we do not want to come to this happy conclusion by merely defining freedom as high income. That is, we want to have a scientific hypothesis that says that leaving people alone, on the whole, causes them, as it did in the 19th and 20th century, to, as the English say, have a go. And go they did, with astonishing innovations since 1800 that have provided us with the capabilities that Amartya speaks of. It was not the large, here's the problem, you see. In Amartya's way of talking in English, he's in essence saying, and he might quarrel with this, but I don't think so, that the large, modern, bossy, goods-providing state, taking 40 or 50% of national income to spend on its projects, is the cause of our enrichment in the last couple of centuries. And I would claim that the great enrichment of Italians moving from $3 a day per person in modern prices to over $100 a day came not from state action on the whole, but came from human action, whose exercise depends on negative liberty. The outcome was an increase of 3,000% in the ability of Italians to buy education, healthcare, food. And therefore, a proper negative liberty, non-slavery to a master or a husband or the secret police, has nothing to do with what our US president called in 1941 the second pair of his four freedoms. In this famous speech of his, Roosevelt was trying with his splendid eloquence to rouse the American population to care about the war against fascism. As in 1941, most Americans did not care. He advocated in his first two freedoms, freedom of speech, which we all agree is a fine thing. And indeed, in universities in the West right now, it's under a certain attack. An attack which is, I must say, is minor, but by comparison with the attacks on the liberty of universities in places like China or Russia or Turkey. But still, there's a concern here. Kathleen Stock in England resigned from her post at the University of Sussex after harassment by transgender activists who did not like her essentialist views of the definition of a woman. Now, I disagree with her on this point very much indeed. The popular novelist R.K. Rowling has similarly unpleasant views. But we should all, I think we agree, defend to the very death the rights of Stock and Rowling to have incorrect, even offensive opinions. So it's indeed our responsibility to keep the traditions of universities like yours for free speech, freedom of worship, which was Roosevelt's second one of the four freedoms, was, to put it mildly, controversial in the medieval European universities. Although the Veneto, you understand, inclined to the tolerance necessary for a commercial civilization, and their people were not the most obedient sons and daughters of the Pope at Rome. So those two, free speech and freedom of religion, I'm in favor of, and so should we all be. But the next two were freedom, again, this English word, a Germanic word, of freedom from fear and freedom from want, which is to say, freedom to get an income from the state. Now, if the state takes from Giovanni and gives to Dario, Dario is, of course, pleased, at any rate, if he doesn't worry about the negative liberty which is not being granted to Giovanni. Giovanni views this imposition as a case of governo ladro and engages in the Italian indoor sport of evading taxation. But the modern state has enormously increased its ability to arrange such transfers from Giovanni to Dario. So I'm arguing that this extension of the state beyond its defense, to the extent it's interested, and it's often not, in the negative liberty of its individual citizens, is a dangerous one. I've always been amazed, in fact, that Italian liberals are rare, even though Italy has a distinguished history of thinkers like Einaudi, the framer of the 1947 Constitution, in that recent tradition. I think indeed that few educated Italians think it's a fine idea to give more power to the Italian state, to the Swiss or the Swedish state perhaps, but not to Rome. Giving more power to most states in the world is like giving alcohol to a teenage boy. Giacomo Leopardi wrote, "Dico che il mondo è una lega di birbanti." This was in the 1830s, and he went on to give many persuasive examples. But he would have no trouble at all in finding many more examples in the recent behavior of the Italian or the American state. So I say, liberty is liberty is liberty. The right to be left alone applies certainly to whom you love. You know the unhappy history in Northern Europe of legal persecution of homosexuals, for example. But I'm arguing that this liberty should apply to economic activities too. No one outside of Xi Jinping's China or Stalin's Russia or Hitler's Germany would think it was a fine idea to have state regulation of, say, music. You would not think it's a fine idea to have an Italian ministry of rock music choosing which bands you could hear. The tyrannies do not agree, which is why, for example, jazz music, with its improvisations, was not approved by the Soviet state. The Soviet state admired top-down planned music, such as the modern orchestra or the modern ballet. Now, language is the greatest case of what's been called spontaneous order. And indeed, you would also be horrified if it was proposed to have an Italian Ministry of Language. It's true that in Italy, the imposition of the dialect of Firenze and Siena had large effects on how Italians speak. But it would be absurd to imagine some person in Rome deciding in detail how you should speak. Now, I say that this modern spontaneous order of largely leaving people alone to choose their friends, to choose their bands they want to hear, to choose how they speak, and indeed how they buy things, what they buy from whom, allowing them to enter occupations as they will, allowing them to start up a new company if they want, has worked out extremely well for us. And it seems to me, and I think it's very plausible, that in the next 50 or 100 years, this liberalism in the economy, that I'm advocating will eliminate world poverty, as in very large extent it already has. My point is that it's strange to draw a line around the economy and say that it shouldn't be as free as language or friendship or the other parts of our life. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man said that the right of property is absolute. It's interesting to note that the 1947 Italian Constitution is much less enthusiastic about this right of property. But I say that this very productive and good negative liberty, this modern form of it, is extremely hard to maintain in an economy in which 40 to 50% of income is seized by the state for its purposes. The state claims that these purposes are, of course, positive liberty. But when you examine them in detail, you often find that they're, in fact, subsidies for allies of the state. So in short, we have a problem. As Friedrich Hayek said in 1944, there's a danger of the road to serfdom, not so much in the obvious institutions of socialism, but psychologically. That we've come to think, as many ordinary Italians and Americans do, that the government should be in charge of the economy in a way that they would be horrified to think it should be in charge of other large parts of our life. And yet I don't despair. Many noble institutions staffed by men and women with deep ethical convictions protect our liberties yet. One was the Italian prosecutors and judges in the 1990s who stood up to the mafia and its state-protected crimes. Another is Italian journalism, still completely independent. But look how quickly Erdogan killed off a free press in Turkey, so watch out. But still the most ancient and glorious of these free liberal institutions is the idea of the European university, of which the University of Padova is a splendid example. It has sheltered such liberated thinkers as Copernicus, William Harvey, Cardinal Pole, Tasso, Galileo, of course, and it must be admitted, Casanova too. The university's motto is Universitas Patavina Libertas, which means the universal liberty of the University of Padova is universal, that is for all. So it is. So it is. Let's keep it for another 800 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor McCloskey. Also for this conclusion, wonderful for us because you described and discussed so well our motto. So the freedom of Padua, universal and for everyone. So thank you. We have many questions now from the audience and from my colleagues. First question is related to something that is happening exactly in these hours here in Italy. Because yesterday, for the first time, the Italian Parliament amended two articles of the Constitution, number 9 and number 41 of Luigi Einaudi's Constitution, adding the environment, biodiversity, ecosystems, and future generations as entities protected by the Constitution.
I heard
This
about
also
that.
involves this also involves activity because for the first time you can read that economic activity is free, of course, but should not harm health and the environment. So,
Yeah.
do you disagree with such limitation to economic freedom, or do you agree with this kind of interventions?
Well, I don't think it should be a constitutional provision. What's very notable about modern constitutions is how long they are. I mean, look, there are hundreds of items in the Italian Constitution, and I think that this is an opinion that my father, who was a constitutional historian, surely agreed with. A constitution should be overall, should be in general, not in particular. It sort of depends, of course, how it's carried out. This is true of all constitutions. The three Soviet constitutions of the 20s, the 30s, and I think the 1970s were beautiful documents, guaranteeing all kinds of liberties. But then they were carried out by thugs, by violent men. And so they didn't mean what they were, what the words said. I'm not against the trying to help the environment. But again, I think that it's much better for the state to take a very light hand, such as a carbon tax, and leave to the individual ingenuity of Italians and Americans and Germans the implementation. So it's not as bad as the proposal some years ago for a state license. This was proposed in Italy. It fortunately didn't pass. A state license for those men, largely men, who hold the Italian nation in their hands, namely pizza cooks. But it's not wise, I think.
Yeah, it's clear. It's clear. We have a couple of questions from our colleagues in history, economic. Your latest book is titled "Why Liberalism Works," right? Producing more equal and prosperous world for as you say right now. So Carlo Fumian would like to know your opinion about the so-called neoliberalism. In the sense, is this something real or just a label, just an ideology or a flag?
It's not. Yeah, there are some people who look. The phrase neoliberalism is a term of contempt from the left. That's what it is. It's used to speak of me and of other very nice, I must say, 19th century liberals. I call myself a Christian liberal, which is to say that I acknowledge an obligation to the poor and the handicapped. So I'm not a sort of to hell with you version of this. I think it's a grave mistake to think that, say, Milton Friedman, as I've seen him said to be, was the father of world poverty. How absurd. when countries like China and India, who had suffered for many, many years under central planning socialism, abandoned it in 1978 and 1991, Chinese and Indian economic growth zoomed up. And if you ask the average Chinese person, especially, and many Indians, whether they think this liberalism was a bad idea, and ask them if they'd like to go back to Gandhian or Maoist socialism, they'll say, "Hey, no way." So I would sweetly disagree with my colleagues that there's something terrible about the liberal ideas that have been important, if not dominant, for the last 40 years. It's not quite true that that book is my last book. I wrote a short book with Alberto Mingardi called The Myth of the Entrepreneurial State. This is largely against Mariana Mazzucato, who sadly is advising the Italian government as we speak. And her idea of a return to centralized regulation of investment is, we can show, a mistake. So please reconsider. And look, there's a very important scientific point here. It's not the case that the great enrichment was caused by the state. It simply was not. The evidence from economic history is overwhelming that it's the liberated creativity of individual Italians that brought Italy from $3 a day to over $100 a day. Largely, the modern state is an obstruction. And by the way, the environment of, say, Venice has improved under modern conditions. Certainly, air pollution in Los Angeles is now practically zero.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have another question from another colleague of mine, that is Gigi Fontana, and his question is, what's in your opinion the role of institutions, such as social structures, family, political institutions, and the system of values in the development of productive systems and economy? So the role of institutions for you.
Well, I make a sharp distinction between formal institutions and those informal institutions that he's speaking of, the family, ethics, the church. Well, the church is a formal institution, but its informal ethical commitments are important. I have another book of the 4 that have come out since the one you mentioned, that's coming out this spring from the University of Chicago Press, which is essentially against neo-institutionalism of the by my friend the late Douglas North, or by Daran Ashimoglu, excellent economist, but a not so good historian. And my view in brief is that ethics matters most of all. As I said about the Soviet constitutions, those are the formal structures. But I could speak of my own country. The formal structures of the United States under Trump held just barely. There were enough judges in courts and enough ethical administrators, many of them officially Republicans, to stand against the attempt to turn the United States into a fascist country, as the Trumpians still want to do and are still in danger of accomplishing. But it was ethical standings, not that there are courts, but the behavior of the people inside the courts, and the behavior, for example, in the American case of the Army. The Army, unlike what happened in virtually all tyrannies, such as Myanmar, didn't obey Donald Trump. He wanted to stop the election of a new president with force. So if by institutions you mean ethics, yes. If by institutions you mean constitutions, no.
Very clear. Thank you. I have another question related to history, because you told about the factors that led in the history to advancement in human achievement and prosperity, and so on. So do you believe in progress? I mean, we have read Steven Pinker's books on the fact that we need to be more optimistic about humanity's social, economic, and technological progress, and so on. But we know this progress came with a price. The price is inequality. So what do you think about inequalities in this picture of progress?
Well, in the book you mentioned 5 books ago, I emphasize, I have a long section where I discuss the matter of inequality, which is the currently fashionable criticism of the economic system we've had in many countries since around 1800, which I prefer to call innovism. I think the word capitalism is extremely misleading from a scientific point of view. It suggests that accumulation of capital is what made us rich, when what actually made us rich is innovation, new ideas. But in fact, innovism has increased equality, not decreased it. And in that book that I mentioned, and in an article, a long article, a review of Piketty's first book, I show that he's wrong. Look, let me just give one point, and then because there are lots of points to be made. It's not disgraceful, his book. It was a serious scientific attempt, but it's wrong, as science, often is. I mean, people make hypotheses and they turn out to be wrong. Here's one reason why increasing inequality is not a problem. It is that he ignores human capital. Every once in a while in that first book, he stops to say why he ignores human capital. He says, oh, you can't trade humans like they're slaves. Well, that's not to the point. You could have a law where we're not allowed to trade land or factories, for that matter. And yet, surely, land and physical capital are capital. So he's grossly mismeasured the sources of income in the modern world. Because if there's one thing we know about the economic history of the last century, It's that human capital has become very, very important. Our ancestors, all of them, yours and mine, got their income, take it, there are very few descendants of the crowned heads of Europe here, from their backs and their hands. If I forget the O Jerusalem, may my right hand lose its cunning. But that's not true anymore. We get our incomes. I don't mean just professors or something, but most people get their incomes from their brains. So it's a gross scientific error to not include human capital, or for that matter, as he also does, social capital. I could go on and on. In fact, go read the book and you'll see.
Yes, sure, absolutely. We follow this invitation. I have a question that is connected, because you stress a lot innovation and human ingenuity in your thesis. And we like it because we are an institution for innovation, and we stand on our human capital for centuries. But my question is, can we plan or can we predict innovation? So, I mean, what are the social conditions that can promote innovation in a society?
Well, that's one of the problems with Mariana Mazzucato's views. I don't think, again, I don't think she's an evil person, and I'm sure she wants to help poor people as I do. But to say that you can plan discovery, which is a deep conviction that lots of people have, is, when you think about it, pazzo. It's insane. If I could predict the future of economics as a science, I would win the Nobel Prize 6 times over. I would just keep writing down what I know is going to happen in economics in 5 years or 10 years. And hey, that'd be great. I'd have like Marie Curie, I'd have 2 Nobel Prizes, maybe 4. But it's crazy. If I could predict the price of housing in Padova, I could take out a second mortgage on my house and make an unlimited fortune. I once wrote a book in 1990 called If You're So Smart. And it's a very sensible challenge for any economist or planner or who claims to know the future of, I don't know, interest rates. If you're so smart, why aren't you rich? So I asked Professor Mazzucato, why is she going around advising the Italian government to do this and that to get future innovations? Why doesn't she just shut up and buy the island of Capri?
Yeah, I agree with you about I study the same topic in science, about the immutability of scientific discovery, and that is crucial. Thank you. I have a final question that is very frequent among our students, among our young part of our community. Many scholars argue that capitalism is incompatible with true ecological transition. That they say that within capitalism we cannot solve the environmental crisis. Do you agree, or do you think differently?
Well, I'm of 2 minds. For certain kinds of environmental crisis, innovism is the only salvation. Let's take the once widening hole in the ozone layer at the poles. Margaret Thatcher, a conservative politician in Britain and a big user of hairspray, got together with other leaders. When she understood the problem, she was an undergraduate in chemistry, and enacted laws against the fluorocarbons that were causing the problem, and the hole in the ozone layer has collapsed. It's now small. Same with air pollution. When I was a child, I lived in England, in London for a little while, and I once came out of the apartment, intending to go to the coffee house, and this was 1959. The English government had started to enforce rules against soft coal burning, but it hadn't completed it, and I couldn't see my feet. Now, you don't want to walk if you can't see your feet. So I went back in the house. That's completely changed in Britain and in Italy and lots of other places. They're scrubbing the buildings to make them clean again. So, and furthermore, innovation is a very good way forward, I think, for handling the main problem we have now, so far as air is concerned, of global warming. There are experiments in Iceland right now, which has very cheap energy because it's from volcanoes, to capture carbon from the air and bury it permanently. And I don't think this is easy, or oh boy, that'll take care of it, don't worry about it. But it's certainly an improvement. Electrical vehicles are surely an improvement. Using even gas instead of coal. The problem the Germans have is that they hate carbon-based generation of electric power, but they also hate nuclear energy. So, as we say in English, you must have an Italian proverb, they're caught between a rock and a hard place. Whereas the French get over 80% of their power from clean nuclear power. So that's that's kind of the optimistic side. But there's a source of pessimism about species that we can't do anything about, I'm afraid. The number of species in the world is going to continue to fall. The reason is that we travel. That it hasn't got anything to do with manufacturing or how terrible we are by making profits and so on. It's simply because we move around. And over and over and over again, humans have accidentally, sometimes intentionally, brought other species into new environments that they didn't have. So essentially what's happening is that the supercontinent of Pangaea in geological history is being reassembled by us. About that, I haven't got any solution, except I'm in favor of zones in the ocean that you can't fish in, and places all over the place in which you can't hunt. I'm all for that, but I'm not optimistic on that score.
Yes, it's absolutely true. We are in the middle of what we call the sixth mass extinction of biodiversity,
and I'm afraid it's sad, but we can't do anything about it unless we want to stop traveling entirely. And if you have to stay in Padova, as we did during the COVID-19 crisis, that's not so bad.
Exactly. Exactly. So thank you so much. Your content has been a great introduction to our series
Thank you, dear.
about freedom. So it was a great pleasure for the whole community here in Padua to listen to you. So thank you so much, and we hope to see you soon. Anyway, in Italy and in Padua.
Ciao, ciao, bambini. Un bacio
Ciao
ancora.
ciao. See you soon. Bye bye. Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.